So, this is an interesting question. In the wake of Inside Out being almost upon us by now, and admittedly new trailer footage coming out that I kind of would argue is too close to spoiler territory, I've now seen 2 different articles talking about Inside Out being a worthy replacement main franchise for Pixar Studios. Alright. Since 1995, clearly Toy Story has been the golden goose and arguably the only movie series to be fairly consistent in quality. But now with a 5th one on the way, doubt has begun to set in. Maybe it finally is time for Pixar to hang up this franchise as the main icon of the studio, and instead move on to this new era with a clearly still pretty young franchise that could still expand into all sorts of directions after the 2nd movie. Do these articles have a point? Now, in proper news reading fashion, I've deliberately not actually read the bodies of these articles, just looked at the headlines of course, but mostly in this context it's to form my own points first, so do bear with me if there's some overlap here. But yeah, let's get into this. So first up, why is Toy Story the one that's seen as the mainline franchise in the first place for Pixar? Pretty obvious, it is their longest running and most successful franchise, plus it was what they started with. It is literally the mascot from day one. I don't think there's another franchise of 4+ installments that has Toy Story's level of combined financial success and quality. And even then, the quality only gets better every time as we get closer to photorealistic generation. I mean, this thing is a freak of nature that stands by itself, which is why it's not easy to replace. It's what kicked off the studio. They've essentially bookended each decade with each sequel. Toy Story 5 actually ruins that pattern, so never mind. And the 3rd one had the rare accolade of being nominated for Best Picture. No animated movie has ever done that since. Not to mention the merch, of course, has made a lot of money. It's a success that you simply cannot plan for. So why replace it at all? It definitely feels like Bob Iger mandated it out of Damage Control after the Bob Chapek car crash-a-thon. Besides, after wrapping up the Andy era story in Toy Story 3 and Woody's of course in Toy Story 4, where else do you even go? Carry on with Bonnie without Woody? Do a Toy Story with a new ensemble in another kid's room? I don't think so. A new angle would be interesting, like a new cast of toys, but that just wouldn't be Toy Story as we know it anymore. You can do it without Buzz and Woody, but your billion-dollar gross isn't coming along with you. It's like doing a Buzz Lightyear movie, but with an entirely different cast, you know? I do think the cast will be back for Toy Story 5, but I also think that this 5th installment needs to be the final. It's like my argument for ending the Simpsons franchise, which we covered earlier in the month. It's better to go out on a bang than a whimper, you know? And it's only really doing a disservice to continue something so long that the only end in sight seems to be when it's in real life that we end up losing some of the core voice cast that affects the direction of the franchise. In fairness, for Toy Story, this was fine in Slinky's case. They've done that well for 2 movies now. However, though 4th did its best with Potato Head stock recordings of Don Rickles, his general silence in that movie was hard not to notice. He's such an iconic part that it was weird how sidelined him and actually a bunch of the core cast were in Toy Story 4. I'm sure that ensemble imbalance will be remedied in the 5th, but anyway, the point is this cast are also all getting older. You can't forever rely on wheeling them out every time you want an extra billion from Toy Story. Although this is Disney we're talking about here. And yeah, as Lightyear showed, whilst he did a decent job as Buzz, you can't deny he ultimately wasn't bought into as a replacement for Tim Allen. These voices are people's childhoods. You can't replace all of them, especially in the animation sphere. Anyway, let's hope the 5th is for sure a finale and can actually wrap things up from there. Maybe have Woody and Bo Peep return to adult Andy to be the toys for their children he's since had. There's your tear generator for you, I don't know. Anyway, with Toy Story all set to be retired after this one, and you'd hope so anyway, why not another major Pixar franchise being the new mascot for this 2nd season, I guess? And actually, there's a good handful of options. You have the Cars movies, which is probably the next best, most popular Pixar franchise, as much as I don't think they're anything crazy spectacular. I'll blame that on the kids that were shouting and throwing popcorn at each other the first time I watched it in cinemas. And then going beyond that, while there are some great original Pixar classics, when they start getting expanded into sequels, a lot of the general quality of the franchise seems to dip. because yeah, the Pixar sequel era that we had a few years back is often seen with frustration, as they did them all relatively close to each other and none came near to the potential of their origins, you know? Monsters University was pretty decent, to be fair, although again, we all only really like the final act. It also tried to be daring in its prequel approach, and even now gets a spin-off on Disney+. So I think for me personally, perhaps the Monsters Inc. universe would be my initial pick for a solid Pixar franchise, but the problem ties into also why they even did a prequel. The scaring energy concept that fueled the first movie doesn't work anymore. The laugh factory resolution to the movie completely closed off the scare stuff. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't do a sequel. We have the sequel series that somewhat explains the direction of energy as an industry in the future, as was rolled out by Monsters at Work putting out their second season, but it's clear that this one just doesn't have the consistent conceptual legs to have Toy Story level sequels put upon it, and to be the mascot going forwards. Hey, thank you for making it halfway through this video. This is the quick plug to tell you to subscribe, or let me know your opinions on this potential argument. Also, would you consider the current Inside Out 2 trailers to be a bit too spoilery for your taste, or would you like me to cover it? I'd genuinely be curious to hear what you think, and I shall now let you get back to the second half of this good old debate of whether Inside Out could end up replacing Toy Story. Also, we've got like 4 Pixar videos in a row coming out. I apologize, it just do be like that sometimes. Below that, Finding Dory was pretty good. Again, a country mile away from the original classic, but ultimately not a bad way to take the movie in a different direction from the first. It's just a shame that focusing on the Ellen DeGeneres fish sort of sidelined the father-son relationship from the original and didn't take that anywhere new either. There's only so many times you can find a fish, so we'll say this one doesn't quite work for franchising either. Then, what could have been? Incredibles should have been the one. We waited so long for a sequel, everyone was game, and I really don't like Incredibles 2, I'm sorry. People say it's okay, and I get that, but okay isn't the absolute all-time great we got in the original, is it? If they had smashed the second one, I could see Incredibles being the new Toy Story, show the kids growing up, much like Inside Out 2 is doing now. Plus, it would tie in with the current fad at the time of the superhero genre. This came out in 2018. It was before Infinity War. I mean, it could have been a really interesting part of seeing their growth as a family and giving all sorts of, not so much parodious, but commentary on the state of the world, or heroism and superhero genres, you know? There's so much theming that could have fit if they had kept it back in the time. Or made a sequel anytime sooner than, 14 years later? But yeah, after that second movie, now I'm not so sure with this franchise. Despite that, if they did go to Incredibles 3, I would still want Brad Bird to be involved, just saying. So that leaves with the latest Pixar to really get a sequel and actually be counted as a franchise, Inside Out. Why this one? Well, it goes back to why Monsters Inc. wasn't the pick originally, whereby Monsters Inc. closed down its world-building premise in its resolution, but Inside Out ended up with a showcase of its near-limitless potential instead. Not only is there a world where everyone in it has these personified emotions in their head, but even if you stuck with Riley, any dilemma at any stage of her life is gonna be interesting to follow. With Toy Story, we had to move on from Andy once he grew up. With Riley, you could go through her whole life, and each movie would have a completely fresh and different premise and story to jump off of. Or even if you didn't want to focus on Riley and instead go into the body of someone else, there's so much potential in so many different formats. Whether it is personifying into a dog, or going back to the classic and just having a male protagonist, because those emotions will also interact all differently. Obviously, there are some certain things in adult life you probably should not explore in a family movie. However, in general, just sticking with Riley alone is enough for an interesting franchise. And of course, the children audience can grow up with her. You don't have the almost 30 years of attachments to characters like, say, Buzz and Woody, of course, but the OG movie of Inside Out, comparatively, is only 9 years old. There is so much you can do with the Inside Out concept, and financially, it has the chops too. Although I guess we'll just have to see how the actual success turns around when the second movie comes out. 2024 has been a mixed bag on box offices with a bunch of flops in May, which is really unusual. So if Inside Out 2 doesn't succeed, then forget this whole argument. But I think myself and a lot of people across both audience and industry have a good feeling this one's gonna do very, very well. There was a big reception to the first trailer dropping online. The hype is all behind this one, which, by the way, Lightyear didn't really have. After Lightyear and a couple quieter results for the studio, by their standards anyway, Elemental still ended up quietly crossing $500 million despite its initial flop status. This feels like it's gonna be Pixar's true return to prominence. For the past while, I've highlighted how they felt somewhat behind other studios such as DreamWorks and Sony, when in the past they were obviously the trailblazers. I mean, hey, they've at least been putting out better stuff than their stablemate Disney Animation, you know? Whilst I think we're now beyond the times where Pixar was the clear gold standard above the rest, which is more to the credit of how well other studios have been doing recently, I do think Pixar can restore their status as a key player in the game again. And this is step one. As much as I'm grossed out by the full Disney assault of Inside Out 2, Moana 2, Zootropolis 2, Toy Story 5, and Frozen 3 and 4, I do think this first one at least makes some sense. The director has said himself that they've had this idea churning for a while, so it's the most organic of the projects for sure. This is probably the most audiences have had a taste for a Pixar sequel since The Incredibles. Again, please do better than how that one turned out. Thematically, it just lost all the points of the original. And if all goes well, I can see a lot of potential in Inside Out becoming Pixar's next big franchise, and indeed, a worthy successor to the Toy Story saga. On the mascot front, sure, you can still show Woody and Buzz as a good old P&G on all your marketing for Pixar as a brand, but for a franchise to actually keep up front and center and mainline, yeah, Inside Out really fits the bill. Other than that, I'm just gonna once again make my pitch that Inside Out 2 needs to end with a Cars-style credit scene, going into the emotions of other Pixar characters' heads. I'm telling you, we need it. Give fish versions of the emotions with the Finding Nemo characters. Make Inside Remy's head laid out like a kitchen, and God knows what you do when you go into Lightning McQueen's biologically confusing head, abdomen. But I'd still like to see it, okay? It'll only open more questions to that franchise, and that's fun in its own right. Do it, Pixar. That's your billion-dollar movie right there. But on that note, I'm gonna end it off there. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this video. Do you think Inside Out can be the next big Pixar movie series on main? Let me know in the comments or on our Discord server, and I'll get around to reading those articles finally, eh? As I shall see you in a little bit.